also want to thank you guys for getting this channel to over 2,000 subscribers. I really do appreciate all of your comments and your support, and of course I'll do my best to continue putting out enjoyable content. Also, if any of you happen to be NieR fans, be sure to keep an eye out for my very next video. This video contains spoilers for both NieR Replicant and NieR Automata. If you have not completed both of those games in their entirety, then I highly suggest you click off of this video right now. If you have, well then, enjoy the video. I believe it would be fair to say that it is well understood that what we consider to be our reality is shaped almost entirely by our perception of ourselves and by extension the world around us. This perception is often rooted in our early experiences from our formative years and continues to be shaped by the events that take place throughout our lives. Our perception is always shifting, constantly prone to change, and as we learn and grow, so do our views. This video won't be an extremely deep dive into the psychology or the philosophies surrounding perception. As interesting as that might be, I do not trust myself to do that sort of video much justice, especially compared to many of the great minds that have already done it before. And whilst I'm sure it'd be fun to talk about how the camera angles in NieR are a literal in-game way of playing with perspective, which it's worth noting they most certainly are, that's also not what I want to focus on. Instead, I'm going to make the focus of this video be primarily in regards to the very thing I believe has been the central conflict of the NieR series so far, and that is the perception of the enemy.
They are not but a horde of faceless minions. Swat them aside! Focus on the small ones first.
In both the NieR games, the identity and intent of the antagonists that you face are presented to you as they would be in most JRPGs, and well, really most fiction in general. They're the faceless horde, the monsters without meaning or reason that exist solely to destroy and bring ruin. There's no nuance, there's no depth, they have no meaning, but as the saying goes, there's two sides to every story. Our perception of these enemies is initially shaped by our very first encounters with them. In Replicant, you are introduced to this boy. You don't know who he is, but the details don't matter. All you can assume is that he's your protagonist, some monsters have approached him, they're growling and clearly armed, and the game has prompted you to attack and defend. So that's what you do. After that point, you discover that he has a sister, and that sister is clearly sick. This now provides both the character and the player a reason to fight that goes beyond simple self-preservation. And when I say our perception is shaped by our first encounters, I mean even down to the very first shot we see of the shades. Notice how we first hear the growling of what most would assume is some sort of dangerous monster, and then we're immediately shown what can only be a weapon being wielded by some faceless creature as it approaches our protagonist. Now this may seem like a minor detail and may be obvious, but it's these types of small details that play with our perception of things. The prologue establishes that the shades are monsters that threaten NieR and his little sick sister, and so most of us can relate to his desire to fight and kill as many of them as possible, as we're just assuming that, like in most games, they're simply monsters that attack without much reasoning. In the case of the machines in Automata, it's basically the same thing, except the premise here is that the androids and machines are at war, and the androids are fighting to protect and preserve their human creators. You start the game quite literally being attacked by a faceless red beam, witnessing your allies be blown out of the sky one by one. It's immediately quite clear that whoever these machines are, they are clearly your enemy. The reasons that we as the audience have for fighting the enemy are in sync with the reasons that the protagonists have. NieR is fighting the Shades because they're a threat to him and more importantly his sister. In Automata, Yorha is fighting against the machines because they're in a war. Both premises are very relatable and easily recognizable in these sorts of stories, so there's no reason to think anything is amiss here. In the early parts of both games, the other characters and NPCs you encounter only further cement these views.
There's no actual meaning behind anything machines do.
They are naught but a horde of faceless minions.
The characters are constantly dismissing any idea that they could be anything more than simply monsters or machines, and that knocks aside any doubts that we as the player may have about the righteousness of our actions. With all that being said though, there is a difference in the way that Automata and Replicant both go about presenting their antagonists. In Replicant's case, none of the characters ever really stop to wonder if the Shades may have a reason behind their behaviour, and in NieR's case it's pretty clear he doesn't care. Now to be fair, in the first part of the game he is still a boy still, so his lack of thought to the matter can easily be understood. In the little speech he gives to introduce the world, he even says that he can't worry about the Shades because he just has to focus on his sister. I mean sure, yeah, he might fight the Shades, but he does this more because it's par for the course in his world rather than out of any personal vendetta that he may hold. But after the Shadow Lord kidnaps Yona, this completely changes. In part 2, we immediately see him slaying Shades in style, clearly older and more experienced, and now able to wield even deadlier weapons to accomplish his goals. He's a man on a mission, single-minded in his determination to kill every last Shade he sees to save his sister.
It's been 5 years since they took my sister. I spent every waking moment searching for her, but all I found is heartache and despair. This world is winding down. Between the Shades and the Black Scrawl, there won't be anyone left soon. My life now, and my purpose, is hunting Shades.
This violent approach is understandable to us because we just witnessed some random humanoid Shade snatch his sister. This is a trope we're all too familiar with. The clearly evil, big, bad Dark Lord, aptly named the Shadow Lord I might add, has just kidnapped the innocent little sister, and we did just witness the best character in the game sacrifice herself to hold back one of these damn creatures. And all of this took place after a village filled with innocents was being attacked. How could we not at this point sympathize with the protagonist and want to set things right? We've been killing Shades all this time anyway, now we've just got even more reasons to do it. In Automata though, there's a bit of a different approach. Now, bear in mind Automata is the sequel, and whilst most new NieR fans played it before Replicant, those of us who started with the first game may have been more suspicious of the intent behind these machines and what their true purpose was. I can certainly say that was the case for me, because based on what I'd seen in the first game, I already knew that the machines probably wouldn't just be some one-dimensional enemies. And I feel as though whilst Automata isn't a direct sequel following the characters from the first game, that there was some acknowledgement of how the first game handled revealing the truth behind its enemies, because this time around it was made much more apparent that they weren't all the same or quite as mindless much earlier. During the very first mission of the game, NieR says that there's no meaning behind anything machines do, which is of course meant to throw you off, but if anything it just implies the exact opposite. 2B says she didn't think the machines were capable of speech, and even though all the machine is saying is kill, 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 2B surprised at its ability to even do that hints at the possibility that there's more to these machines than even the protagonists are aware of, and that's despite the fact that they've been fighting them for all this time. When you go to the desert housing, there's an entire cutscene that sheds a light on the fact that the machines are mimicking what they understand to be human behaviour. Then we're introduced to a humanoid enemy that's essentially not much different from our android protagonist, now giving a clear human face to the enemy. And after Simone is defeated in the amusement park, we are introduced to a machine literally waving a white flag. Again, another human gesture, and one of peace, resulting in us meeting Pascal and his small pacifist faction. This is completely different to how the Shades and Replicant are handled, because throughout the entirety of Route A, there's nothing from their side of the equation that makes it clear to us that they have their own side of the story. Sure, there's little hints, but again, this is swept aside by the characters as being meaningless. NieR himself is quite clear he'll kill every last Shade, and on a first playthrough, particularly if you have no experience with the NieR series, which at the time of its original release, nobody did, then it'd be easy to not think of his actions as being anything but warranted. So between just these two games, there's a key difference in how the enemies are presented, which in turn changes how we perceive them. Whilst in Automata we still fight machines and ultimately want to stop them, it's made clear to us early in Route A that there is some variance amongst them and that the ways they behave isn't as simple as even Yorha believed them to be, and there's different machine characters that we can interact with that have their own little side quests for us to explore. Whereas in Replicant, you could play through the entirety of Route A and never stop to ask yourself what the motive was behind all of this. Well, at least until probably this moment. And this moment.
We didn't want to fight you. We really didn't want to.
And this moment.
Brother?
Yoda.
Now originally, the mermaid questline wasn't in Replicant or Gestalt. The other two examples, however, happen so late in the game that by the time you see them, it's already too late to begin questioning what's going on. Of course, that's the point. The twist at this point in the story is that the character's belief that they're humans and that the Shades are monsters is completely flipped on its head when Devil and Poplar reveal that it is in fact the Shades who were the original humans, whilst all the supposed humans we'd seen so far were in fact just replicants. It's at this point the true depth and layers to the narrative begin to become clear, and some players may have realised that the NieR we see in the prologue has now become the Shadow Lord, and the Yona from the prologue is now in possession of Replicant Yona's body at the end of the game. She then gives up her own life so that Replicant Yona can live out her life with her brother. The purpose of manipulating our perception in Replicant is so that we go through the game unknowingly bringing about the extinction of the human race whilst believing we are actually on the course to saving it. In Automata, the purpose behind it is a little less clear, which isn't surprising because Automata is more of a vague game than Replicant just in general. But given how, as I've mentioned, Automata is a lot more upfront about the enemies being multi-layered, then it only makes sense that the way events play out would be different. And they are. In the start of Route C, Yorha becomes infected with the logic virus, leading to them turning against 9S and 2B. Those that were once considered allies are now the enemy. To make matters even worse, because 2B is infected too, she basically requests that A2 kills her, but unfortunately 9S sees this, and from his perspective, A2 just killed the girl that he caught feelings for. So in his complete misunderstanding of the situation, he is consumed by rage. With everything he once knew now completely in shambles and lost, all 9S has left to cling to now is his vendetta against A2 and his desire to destroy every last one of his enemies. Sound familiar? It's like his entire perspective now is that almost everyone is his enemy, which he's not entirely wrong about, but the one person who would still be on his side is the main person he has it in for. Even when he comes across the other 2B units in the tower, it's clear his mental state has deteriorated to the point where he even views them as an enemy that he takes some sort of twisted pleasure in killing. He goes from seeing 2B as someone he cherishes and wants to protect to someone he's willing to kill out of some warped idea of still protecting her.
2B! 2B! Don't worry, I'm going to kill you now!
Meanwhile, A2 seems a bit more detached, which might be in part because her tragedy took place prior to the events of the game. She certainly seems colder and more disillusioned from the very beginning, and she has a lot less remorse when it comes to taking out her enemy. But from A2's perspective, Yorha may not have necessarily been the enemy, but she certainly wasn't willing to associate with them anymore. Hence why when we first see her, she says Yorha Command is the ones that betrayed them because she knows the truth about their designations. This is why I say the way the perception of the enemy is presented in Automata is vaguer, but I'd argue also a lot more nuanced. A2's entire existence provides a greyer shade to this situation that isn't quite as present anywhere near as early in Replicant. Automata's presentation is certainly interesting in its own right, and it shows how as events change, those who you might once have perceived as allies can very swiftly become your enemies. Automata made it much clearer in Route A that there's another side of the story, and before we even get to Route B, we're already sympathizing with the machines, understanding that there's clearly more to them. Whilst in Replicant, it's not until we get to Route B where it becomes quite clear that there is actually more going on with our enemies than we might have thought. But what exactly is the reason for this difference? Why is it that in Replicant, the protagonists have no interest in ever trying to understand the Shades, whilst in Automata, 2B and NieR are willing to cooperate with Pascal as well as other machine NPCs that we see around the world, leading to us feeling the emotional weight of different moments with these machines. Perhaps it's because we meet Adam and Eve, two entities that we're told are part of the machine network yet look identical to humans or androids. Maybe it's because of the behaviours that the machines display. Or perhaps it's simply because the machines arguably look cuter than many of the shades do. Whilst I have no doubt these sorts of differences play into both the characters and our own perceptions of these enemies, I think there's one single significant difference between the enemies in Automata and the ones in Replicant that completely shapes how we originally perceived them.
Oh hell, that thing's huge.
As I mentioned earlier, there's two sides to every story, but what good is having another side of a story if it's written in a language you can't understand? Without the ability to understand it, it'd be impossible to connect or relate to the events taking place. In fact, you wouldn't even be able to perceive what events are taking place. In a way, you're rendered effectively blind and deaf to it, and so your perception of events is completely limited by your language. The shades in Replicant are unable to communicate with the protagonists in the ways that the machines can. Sure, they can still communicate through body language and gestures, I suppose, but it's difficult to do even that when the people you want to communicate with see you only as monsters and immediately want to destroy you on sight. Of course, the shades themselves aren't completely innocent in this, but the ones that are violent are only like that because they've become corrupted in the Gestalt project. There's a lot of lore and backstory behind why these shades became the way they are that I won't get into, but that's the point. There is an actual story to be understood here, and the game makes it part of the narrative to explore this. Also, any shades that aren't immediately aggressive know that because humans hate and fear them, they have to do their best to avoid humans, otherwise they'd be killed. This is exactly what we see with Khalil and with the shades that are hiding in the Eyrie. Replicant's Route B provides the missing perspectives that completes the story, the other side that was lacking in Route A. Automata may have shown us more about the machines and provided us with their side of the story, but at least it was clear well before Route B that there was indeed another story there to see, because we could communicate with the enemy. Again, 2B may have been shocked that the machines had the intelligence to talk, but that very ability is what changes our perception of the enemy from the very beginning. What makes Route B and Replicant even more painful is the fact that we're going through the exact same battles and cutscenes we experienced in Route A, but now with the added subtitles to understand what's being said by the enemy. We see shades pleading for us not to harm their children as we mercilessly massacre them, all the while the main characters are jeering with their righteous certainty. There's a sense of guilt we as the player might find ourselves having for being originally complicit in this, and of course continuing to be as such in order to achieve the true ending of the game. The one part of Replicant that always got me the most was the death of Fira, especially because in part 1 of the game we see her as a nice child that's just trying to help us around her strange town. I mean, okay, yeah, she's walking a bit slow and she could have sped it up a little bit, but she's just a kid. I felt the same rage that the king felt at having his bride being brutally murdered only moments after their wedding, and so you best believe I was so pissed at the wolves that I also wanted to kill every last one of them. But with the new perspective of Route B, with me now able to understand the howls and growls of the wolves, with the ability to understand their language, a bridge between worlds was now formed where I could understand their pain, and now suddenly I felt bad for the wolves and I felt bad for the people of Facade and Fira. It was no longer a simple matter of directing my anger at the mindless beast that killed someone, but now it was a soberingly tragic understanding that in this conflict, both sides had been hurt, and because of the inability to understand one another, the pain only goes on. Who fired the first shot doesn't matter at this point anymore. The struggle against the shades is all that is known, and all that can ever be known. If there's any quest in NieR that perfectly personifies all of this, it's the newly added mermaid quest in Replicant. Louise herself is a literal example of how seeing the humanity in someone completely changes everything. When she appears as just a simple human girl, the postman has absolutely no problems being Mr. Nice Guy, but once she reveals herself to be a shade, it's clear he no longer sees anything worth being nice to anymore. And yet, despite her transformation, Louise's feelings towards him clearly haven't changed. In Route A, it's clear that there's something going on with her, that she's saying something that we're not understanding. Again though, this quest wasn't in the original version of Replicant or Gestalt, and I imagine one of the reasons that it was put in this time was to add some of that Automata level foreshadowing in Route A, so that perhaps we could see a bit more humanity in the shades. Regardless, it does act as a great example of just how differently a shade is viewed based on whether or not someone sees the humanity in it. Carne is also another example of this, because her having Tyrion as part of her made many people in her hometown afraid of her, despite the fact she looked just as human as they did. And that's why even though Carne becomes a shade in Route C, both us and NieR still care for her to the point he's willing to sacrifice his entire existence, and our save files, to save her. I mean, imagine, if Louise had the ability to communicate the same way that Carne did, just how differently would things have played out for her? Automata may share a similar struggle where neither side truly knows what they're fighting for anymore and their creators are no longer in the picture, but I would argue it ends on a much more optimistic note. The Red Girls that represent the machine network decided that instead of destroying the human server, they changed their minds based on what they'd seen. They evolved past the point of just wanting to keep the war going instead of continuing a cycle of chaos, with Adam and Eve even offering NieR to join them in the Ark. And all of this is before you have to fight the credits themselves, whereby the pods realize that they too are more than just machines designed to assist the androids. They begin to form emotions and consciousness, and their actions may have resulted in the possible restoration of our three protagonists. And as they themselves say, there's now the possibility for a new future, one that is not given by the circumstances of the past, but one they can now take for themselves. The open-ended nature of ending E in Automata leaves it to viewer interpretation, but regardless, it ends with a much more optimistic and hopeful note for the future than any of the endings of Replicant. Now, since Replicant did add in ending E, we got to see the return of NieR, but originally that wasn't in the game. Now, I'm very glad that they added it in, because it's without a doubt one of the best things I've experienced from a game in a long while, and it was beautifully done.
Thank you. This is what I wanted. This was exactly what I hoped. Oh my gosh, it could have just been cutscenes. I would have been cool with that. But this is what I wanted. Thank you, fucking thank you.
But despite how beautiful the ending may have been, the result is still the same. They still ensure the end of humanity, and even if the ending doesn't exactly make that clear because they wanted to maybe give us a more, I don't know, uplifting end, in many ways the suffering of the machines and the androids in Automata is just a knock-on effect of the decisions made by the protagonist in Replicant. In an effort to save his sister, NieR unwittingly ends up bringing about the end of humanity itself, resulting in a never-ending spiral of life and death for the machines and the androids that would take their place, all a consequence of something as simple as a language barrier. And perhaps the most brilliant part of all of this is that neither game preaches this to you, but simply shows you the other side, allowing you to realize the consequences of your actions for yourself. Seeing Route B doesn't give you a new ending or allow you to now save the world and make new choices and decisions. The story has been set, and there's no changing it. All there is seeing the complete story for what it always was, and always would be. Wow, you actually managed to reach the end of the video. Well, I'm glad. Hopefully it was worth it. Now, for any of my subscribers that have been looking out for this video or just any video from me for the last 6 months, don't worry, I'll definitely have plenty of new content coming out, and this type of new video is just the start of a style of content that I've actually really been meaning to do for ages now. And I'll be doing like a sort of catch-up stream or something, so I'll definitely be talking with you guys very soon. And don't worry, I promise my next video will be dropping much sooner than in 6 months. Okay, so expect to see more NieR content, but also a lot of different types of content too. If you enjoyed this video though, you already know how to show your support, and of course share any thoughts that you may have in the comments below. Thanks again for watching, and anyway, my name is Next Novelist, and that's all I've got to say, and I'm out. Peace.